So this session is responsive design for SharePoint 2013. My name is Cathy. Who am I? I am a senior engineer, just a fancy term for consultant. I work for a company called Planet Technologies. I am a SharePoint server MVP. Actually just got renewed for my second year. Huge honor. I'm very grateful to Microsoft for that. I've been doing SharePoint branding as my primary focus for over 6 years now, which just seems kind of crazy to me because I actually went to art school. So I actually have a fine arts degree in painting, and yet I brand SharePoint sites. So it's a little strange to me. I wrote on a SharePoint 2010 book. I thought about doing a 2013 one, but decided I liked my life a little bit more than I liked writing a book. I'm CatPaint1 on Twitter, and I have a blog, SharePointCat.com.
And my name is Heather Waterman. I'm the director of Interactive Studios. We're based in Hollywood, Maryland. And I live in South Carolina. Anybody know where South Carolina is? Anybody know where Lawrence, South Carolina is? It's in the boonies, out in the country.
I live in Alabama.
So where is it?
It's just south of Greenville. So yeah, lots of cows, lots of all sorts of animals. I've been working with SharePoint since a little bit before 2007. You can find me on Twitter, hwaterman, and my blog is heatherwaterman.com.
Heather and I like our claim to fame. I live in Alabama, right? I live in a city, but I'm one of the only people ever that used to go to my office at a previous company, and I was late to work one day, and I had to tell the boss, he was like, "Why are you late?" And I had to call in and be like, "Because I'm waiting for the cows to cross the road." Mm-hmm. And he was like, "What are you talking about?" And I'm like, they're changing pastures. They're driving across, they're walking across the road. I have to wait. Like, I can't turn around. It's a 2-lane road.
I'm lucky enough to work from home, so.
Now I do.
My commute is much easier. Okay, so our agenda today, we're going to go ahead and introduce you to responsive web design, which you also may hear RWD. We're going to talk about when, where, and if you should create a responsive design. What are the reasons? Why are you going to do it? What are your client needs? We're also going to talk, there's a lot of different discussions going around about responsive web design. So if you read a bunch of blogs, you hear, "Oh, you should do this." You read another one, it says, "Oh, you should do this." And then we're going to show you a responsive 2013 website that we built. And we're going to talk about a couple of different ways to create responsive designs.
Okay. So when you think about web development, responsive design is one of the newer forms of web development. It's not necessarily a SharePoint specific type concept. So that's why when Heather says there's a lot of discussions going around, there are many schools of thought on how and why and what you do to create responsive web design. Responsive web design is a design that design and development should change based on your screen resolution, your browser type, your device. And that is the whole concept of it. So then it's how do we make that happen? There are 3 components to responsive web design. It's a mix of flexible grids and layouts. How do we move things around? It's that use of flexible images and media. And it's also the CSS and media queries. Now, we make use of all of these in different methods for different things. And obviously, with SharePoint, it's fairly complex to brand. We have our own unique challenges when it comes to responsive design for SharePoint.
So here you can see a couple of different layouts that you might want to target when you're doing your responsive web design. And again, this is all based on your design and your customer needs. So these are just suggested, and they call them breakpoints that you could design for. So you've got your 800, your 640, your 320, and all the way down to.
So you start to look at it, you start to think about what it is. So browsers,
right?
Maybe a
smaller browsers,
Surface,
tablet,
an iPad, and then you get some, other devices down to cell phones. We have to think about it. We have users that do 800 by 600 resolution on their website. But we also have the same company. We can have somebody like me who has a giant screen and has a gigantic resolution.
Exactly.
But then down to my phone, right? We're all so connected, it has to work on multiple sizes. Here's some examples. So we went out and found a bunch of different sites and pulled them in to give you examples of responsive. Not all of these examples are SharePoint. We have some SharePoint examples later on. This one is not a SharePoint design.
How many of you, I got a quick question. How many of you actually test sites when you go to them to see if they're responsive now? You just go on and say, I want to see if this is responsive and what they've done, and move your browser. Okay.
So this is one of my favorite ones, the food sense. So you can see the 3 different ways, and you'll see some of the things that you can notice. The big thing to see that on this one you can tell that it's responsive is where the logo is, right? So on the full browser, it's off to the left next to the image, then it moves above it as the screen gets smaller, and then as we get down to, say, a phone, it is even smaller and moved to the top and centered. So that you can look for those visual cues as you look at different sites to see if they're responsive.
Right. The navigation also moves too, from the left to the top, and then it goes above the logo, and it's much
drops
smaller.
the icons.
Okay, so again, when you're making a responsive web design, a lot of suggested that you use a grid-based layout. Now, what is a grid-based layout? Well, it's simply just a bunch of numbers. It's cut up. You've got different ones that you can choose from. You've got your 960, and I forget all of them. But again, the grid-based system is a tool. It's not, you don't have to use it, but it's meant to give you a starting point for your layout. Some of your common grid systems are the 960. You've got your Twitter Bootstrap, your flexible system, grid system generator, your flexible CSS grid, and many more. Do you have to use a grid system? Absolutely not. You can make your own grid, as long as it's flexible. Now, you can create your design with pixels. You can create your design with percents. You can do EMs. Whatever is going to work for you. It's helpful, but not necessary. But again, it depends on your project and your client needs.
So I have to say, the grid system is my biggest challenge because I went to art school and got a painting degree for a reason, because I don't like math. So for me, that's my biggest challenge, is setting up that grid system. So I typically try to use either the 960 or the Twitter Bootstrap grid system. Mm-hmm. And I go out and I have my Photoshop files, right, that I'm going to be creating my design in. And I set up those blue line grids, and then I save it as a template, and I just put my design in that every time because it's already set up, math's already done for me. But how do I take it beyond that? So I've got this grid, I've got this design, right, and I've gone in, I've probably mocked it up or designed it in, say, a Photoshop or another file system. What do I do beyond that? The next thing is we have to think about those images. So thinking about that food sense site that we looked at, they had the icons, they had the logo, that big main image resized. We have to think about how are our images going to work within our site. So here's a full screen. One more time.
Blank screen.
My PowerPoint animations, I'm using 2013 again now, and it's getting a little challenging for me. So you can see how it changes. Not only are our images moving around, but also our fonts, some of that's resizing, right? So we have to think about how we're going to do that. This is I'm going to move to the next one, flexible images and media. So what does that mean? Is I have this, and as I'm thinking about making it move and resize based on my grid, based off the device size, the resolution, the device type, I also have to think about things like my image, or I have a video embedded. How is that going to work? Is it going to resize? Is it going to move around? So that's what it is here. You can see here, go back one done yet.
Sorry.
Image is the main way you can image, embed, object, video. Max width is the main CSS way to do flexible images and media, right? But there are limitations to that. What are those limitations? IE6 isn't supported. Well, guess what? It's not for SharePoint either. So we don't have to worry about that one as badly. I don't know, has anybody in here still doing IE6 for SharePoint? Because I know I have. Some customers, depending on who they are. For me in the US, it's healthcare and financial institutions that built big custom programs that have to run on IE6. It's actually cheaper for them to pay me to beat my head into a wall to make SharePoint work with IE6 than to rewrite those programs. But IE6 is not supported for max width. The same, there are issues at times with Windows and the max width. How does that affect us? Well, in IE7 and lower, there are some implications with working with it. Great for us that are using Windows 8, right? Because now they fixed it. But if your Windows 7 and higher is fixed below, so but you can see we have our IE7 lower, Firefox 2 and lower. How do we get around that? So you can do that, get around it in multiple ways. There's an alpha image loader class, like way old school. Like if you go back in your days when we used to use that alpha image loader, you can use that to scale your images for those limitations. But what do we do? How do we create it? This is a big one for me. When I'm doing it, a lot of times I have that giant background image, whether it be a gradient or a design in the background of my website. And so I'm thinking about this, and I'm looking at it, going, how's that going to work? Because it needs to be gigantic, and it needs to be tiny. And then I think about things like banner images. They need to be gigantic, and they need to be tiny. So there's multiple ways to do it. A lot of people create a giant file, right? And then they just use the size that's needed. And they use the overflow hidden and the scale percentage to size it down. People also use multiple images, right? The concept of using an image that's targeted to that device. You'll notice the little asterisk there because SharePoint actually, 2013, they gave us something for this. It's really exciting, and we're going to talk about them in a few minutes. They're called image renditions. The next thing, by the way, all of that flexible image stuff, the max width, the alpha image loader, those restrictions, it works not just with images, but with video as well. So you can have your videos embedded in there and have them work. Now, when you start looking at, it works fairly well with Flash. Silverlight has its issues. The next part is media queries, right? So this is kind of the web design world of device channels, which we have for SharePoint 2013. This is basically saying, I want to target to a specific media. We've done this for years, right, with our CSS files for print or for, my mind just blank, screen. Thank you, my mind just went blank there. So there are multiple media types defined by the Web Standards Group, W3C. Here they are. So all, obviously, every device. The big ones that we use now, handheld and screen. Handheld is a huge one. It's a fairly newer one. It's used for our handheld devices, right? So we can use a more general handheld CSS media query that goes down to small screen and limited bandwidth. Here's the rest of them. Projection, screen, speech. The big ones that I always see is the handheld, the screen, the print, right? Mm-hmm. And then sometimes I see it for the TTY, for if you're trying to do really highly compliant sites that are going to be read by screen readers.
Right.
How do you apply that? It's pretty simple. You would have your at media type, this one, media screen. This is basically a query, right? So we're saying if the media is screen, so if it's a browser, and it has a minimum width of 1024 pixels, then you apply the question, whatever the type is. So it's the two questions. What is the media? In this case, screen. And then the query is the stuff in the parentheses. So you can do min width, you can do max width, you can do all those different CSS styles in it and have it look and see if I'm using a handheld and the screen resolution is this, change my CSS to this. Here's how we would do it. You could do it two different ways. You can always do things multiple ways, right? That's my favorite thing about the web. When I go out and I do things that are not on SharePoint sites and I'm doing regular web or changing the look of a .NET software program, I'm always amazed that I can typically do things like 23 different ways to get it to work because I'm like, ooh, SharePoint's teaching me things. Same way, we can do it two different ways. You can do a link with your media type there, or you can do an import. Yeah, sample, easy stuff. Why do we do it? Why do we do responsive design, Heather?
Because technology has given us so many different things to look at on, so many different devices. If you think back years ago, we didn't have the cell phones, we didn't have anything. At least I remember that.
I see this just looking out into this room right now. We have iPads, we
Yes,
have laptops,
exactly.
we have mobile phones,
So
pen and paper. Don't see that very often.
when the
I don't have a media type for that. I'm just.
It used to be that you really couldn't see a good site on a phone until the iPhone came around. And when the iPhone came around, it really introduced that whole thinking of, wow, I could actually browse the web on a phone. I can do more with this phone. And so things really started taking off from there. And so that's why we do it. I mean, we want you guys to see our sites on the tablets, on the phones, on anything that you're using, and make sure that you're getting the content that you need. So that's why we do it. So here's a couple of sites, and I believe these are my SharePoint sites. So I found some SharePoint sites that were responsive. So you can see the 3 different versions that I picked out. So we got the London and Partners. Also, you've got Welcome to Maryland. I think there was CTA Institute. I can't read the next one. It's too small. And then the Marshfield Clinic. Okay, so Maryland.gov, again, you're going to see the different views here. One thing I want to point out, if somebody could look at the mobile view, is there anything that you would change on that mobile view, on any one of those last 2 right here, to make it easier? Any suggestions? Exactly. Maybe the image could have gone away, and you actually can't even read the logo anymore when it's this small. You could have moved these things up, and then when you actually go smaller, and I think you click on the menu, you can see everything here. But all of this could have gone away and could have moved all the content up, and you would have given your user more of the information that they're looking for, because this is really not necessary, in my opinion.
But somebody paid for the expensive image, so that's worth it.
But
Probably.
as designers, we all look
Yeah.
at things and we're like, I would have done that differently.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, that's my opinion. Okay.
I'm like you. Somebody paid a lot of money to get that picture taken, and they wanted it
Exactly.
there regardless.
So here's the next site, and this is a SharePoint site. So what I found what was odd was that when I actually got to a smaller width, it kind of gave me a mobile-looking view. So I see that, and I see things have moved around, and it's nice. But then when I actually got to the mobile view, it was a site. And you really couldn't do anything with that. It was too small to actually...
They half made it responsive is kind of how I looked at it.
So, I mean, maybe that was just for tablet, and they just didn't do a mobile site. This one, Marshfield Clinic. So again, it actually resizes very nicely. I thought it was really good. So I went down to this size, everything moved down, the image was smaller, so they were doing the resizing Cathy was talking about. The logo went smaller, the Explorer moved up, and then you've got your images here. And then when you went smaller to the mobile, again, something that they probably could have done to give their users more content is remove the image and move these up. And then when you actually click on Explore, you get these icons. Maybe they could have been smaller, because then you still have to scroll to actually see those icons. So again, you have to think about what is your user going to want to see as soon as they get to the mobile view. So that's important.
As an aside, most of these SharePoint sites that we're showing you are 2010 SharePoint.
Yeah.
So these responsive concepts don't just apply to 2013, right? We can do responsive design for SharePoint in older versions. 2007, I think, is just really extremely painful to do it in.
Yes.
But 2010, we did make responsive designs in.
Right.
But you can start to look at these and start to think about what are the design considerations when we're looking at doing responsive design. There's a lot of considerations and things we have to think about beyond that grid system and the image for how we're going to change it. When you're doing responsive design, you don't just design one mock-up, right?
Right.
We have to design a mock-up for the different sizes because we have to know how things are going to shift around.
Right. Example, I've just been given a project, and we said, well, do you want to make this responsive? Do you want this to work on a mobile site? Yes, but those designs are coming later. So It's, you know, it's really helpful if you have all of those designs up front, because then you take all of that into consideration when you're actually creating your master page and your CSS. So it's
I
very
love
helpful.
it's coming later.
Yeah.
That's
They
one of my
still
favorites.
They still have to do
You
that.
get that in 6 months. No,
Yeah.
no, I need that now.
Okay, CFA Institute. Here's another one. So it comes down, it goes very nicely. But one thing that probably would have helped is to remove this, because there's a lot of content under here that you could have gotten to. And I'm not sure that that's super important.
Scrolls.
It's
It's
yeah,
important
it scrolls.
to somebody.
Yeah. But that's another one. Again, that's my opinion.
We tend to do very minimalistic
Yeah.
web, if you didn't notice that.
Okay.
So when do you do it, right? So I run into this a lot, work with clients every day, right? And we ask the question, when you come in on a project, do you want it to be responsive? And then they always kind of, well, what is responsive? And then you kind of go through it, and they always say, well, yeah, we want that, right?
Then they say,
So-
how much time is it going to take?
Right.
How much
So
more is
I
it gonna
always say,
cost?
okay, well, let's get down to it. What are we trying to do? What is the purpose of your site? Because I need to know how much money you want to spend. Right? That's really what it comes down to. Doing this responsive design, it's great. And it gives us a lot of flexibility in what devices we look at and how we can look at our sites. The big question then comes down to, especially if I'm looking at intranets, what is my purpose? Looking at document libraries and lists and trying to do that responsive gets really costly, and the user experience starts to degrade, right? So this is when we start to get into when is it appropriate to do responsive design. So for me, it's always my first question is, what type of site is it? Right? If it's public facing, it's almost a no-brainer. If I'm putting this out there for the public to go view, it's almost a no-brainer. Just because we look around this room here and we've got iPads, we've got Surfaces, we've got iPhones, we've got Windows phones, all of these different things that people are going to use to get to our site. So if I go to the site and it's got a gigantic image and it loads up and I'm on my iPhone and all I see is image and I'm trying to get information, it's a problem. If it's a pure intranet, right, but I have a publishing layer with information or a few areas that people need to get to, the biggest time I see it is like sales managers who need access to their information on the road. A lot of times we'll do sales sites that are responsive.
So questions you may be asking. Where do I start to make a responsive design? What is it going to give me or the client? And how much do I need to know to create a responsive SharePoint site? So when you start a project, again, you go through the whole questions is, do you want to make a responsive design? Why are you doing this? And what is the client going to get out of this? What are you going to get? What do you want? And how much do you need to know? Well, it's not easy. If you're going to create a responsive web design, you need to know, you need to have very good HTML skills, good CSS skills, good planning skills. You also have to test. You're going to have multiple devices to test in, because when you do create a responsive design, your test time goes way up because you're having to do it so many times.
If you have a 3-week time frame to implement your design and you don't have a team of about 40 people, you might start to have a problem if the device types are large.
Right.
Because you have to test every page on every device, right? And so testing time for quality assurance, end user testing is large for responsive. Right. And you have to build into that not just the testing time, but the fix time, right? Because you're always going to find something that doesn't work right when you're doing testing with a responsive site. SharePoint challenges, right? I like my little guy fighting this dragon because this dragon is SharePoint and we fight him every day. And I had to call in reinforcements because I wasn't going to defeat him alone. So there are design challenges with putting responsive into SharePoint, right? The design manager, separation of the HTML and the master page file. I will tell you that when I am doing responsive, I go old school. And I use just the master page file, the .master file. I go back to that file. I'm not doing it using the HTML version of it, right? I go old school with that. Typically, we have lots of devices, right? Especially if it's public-facing, which is where our no-brainer decision comes into for responsive. Just take a poll of the people sitting around you and what they pull out of their pockets and what they're sitting here working with. The device is large, type of sites. There are extra user experience and branding costs associated with making a responsive design for SharePoint. We all know that SharePoint's kind of hard to deal with when it comes to making it look not like SharePoint. So when you think about then adding the complexity of making it not look like SharePoint on every device we have, right, it grows. Like I said, not typically great for pure intranets. If I am managing documents and managing lists, I will tell you, I tried to convince someone a couple of months ago not to do responsive because they had an intranet, and the primary thing that they wanted to display responsively on an iPhone was a list that had 225 columns. I was not successful in convincing them not to do it, but it's still not implemented, and that was 6 months ago. So there are tools that Microsoft has given us now with SharePoint 2013 that help to make responsive a little bit easier. Remember when I was talking about using different images, different size images? Well, they've given us something called image renditions now. They've also given us device channels, right? And so device channels allow us to be a little bit selective. So they did give us a couple of things to try to make it easier. So what are image renditions? That is taking one image and telling it how big we want it to be for different uses, right? So a couple of things to note about that. You have to, I like that I left my ad screenshots in there. I did add them, so we're going to look at them. Go back though, Heather. So the one thing to note about this is that for it to work, it's a publishing feature, right? It doesn't work in every type of site either, by the way. So like Office 365, you don't get image renditions. So it doesn't work with everything, but it works with a lot. It's publishing, but you have to have the blog cache enabled in the web.config for these to work. So depending on what type of license you have, it's probably automatically turned on. Or you can enable and configure this blob cache. I'm looking at my IT pro friend over here in the corner. She's shaking her head at me like, yes, you can configure it. You can configure it, but blob cache has to be there for our image renditions to work. So what are they in our site settings, right? Underneath look and feel with publishing enabled, image renditions right there. Easy peasy, right? What are they? Here's what they look like. So we can go in and we can create a new image rendition size. As you see here, I have my own little one created right here just to show you that you can create your own. But what it is, it's we go in and we configure a size in pixels, and then we have an image and it resizes based off that size that we set our rendition to be. And you can change it, so where it says click to change, right? So we have the one image and it's basically setting like a frame around it. We can change it, we can go in and move the image around to get it to where we want it to be in that spot, right? But it handles that sizing for us. One image, multiple sizes. So it's a great tool. You can see some of the different ones they have in there. The next thing they gave us, device channels, right? So remember when we talked about media queries earlier, and we talked about being able to say handheld and screen and print? Well, device channels, what they did for us is they gave us the ability within the publishing infrastructure and the design manager to specify a specific master page for a different device. So if I want to target an iPad and I go out and create a master page for responsive for an iPad, I can go tell the device channel what I want it to be. It's browsers and devices. So I can actually set it up for Safari, could set it up for Android, all of those different things through a device channel. They're great, right? Except for the fact that it's multiple master pages, right? So I think it's a great concept. They thought, oh, let's give them device channels. But at the same time, the device channel means separate master page for each of those items, right? So it's kind of, to me, the almost cheater's way of doing responsive, because I don't have to make my master page truly responsive, because I can create one that's specific for that. So it's a little confusing as well. So I don't know, has anybody played with trying to configure device channels yet from the design manager? It's a little confusing as well, like how you actually set them up and apply them, as with everything that they give us, right? It's about 90% of the way there, and it's a little confusing. And then performance as well. You can have a performance hit if you create 500 different ones. Not only now do I have to manage one for every device, but it has to render and load, and it has to think which one is it and pick from the list. So you can have a little bit of a performance impact with them.
Okay.
Now we're going to show you a responsive SharePoint site that we built on 2013. So SharePoint 2013 has limited HTML5 support. So yes, HTML5 support would make it work great, but we can't use all HTML5 in SharePoint 2013.
So I created a responsive design, and what I did was I went out and I found like Twitter Bootstrap, or I found one of those responsive ones. And that's what I wanted to start with. So I loaded that into my master page. You know, I did it old school. I didn't use Design Manager. And from that, I came up with this simple little site. So one of the tools that you can use, a lot of different tools nowadays to test your responsive design. For instance, if you've got an iPhone, you can turn on your Safari in development mode, connect it to your laptop, go into your Safari, and you can see what exactly it's going to look like. So that's one of them. Firefox gives you this great little tool here. It's in the web developers, and you just click on responsive design view, and it puts up this little tab here so you can start to see how this may look in different browsers. So if we go to this one, you can see.
Not only that, it has this great little next to it tab when you get to some of the smaller ones, and you want to say, well, okay, so I'm looking at, does it look like this way? It has a nice little rotate button.
So you can see as it gets smaller what happens. And so the navigation disappeared. Now it shows up. It goes away. And you can rotate it and see what it does. You can scroll up and down. So this is a really good way to start testing your design.
So Heather, this responsive design is a master page and CSS?
Yep, that's all it is. Two things. Oh, and it's using media queries.
Right.
So, of course. The one thing I wanted to show you is when you're using this, and this is why you really absolutely have to test. Because the other day I was trying to edit links, and I went ahead and I made this for my system master page and my custom master page, because, you know, I wanted it to all look really nice, which, you know, most clients are going to do. But if you click in to edit links, I know that's really ugly. I didn't do all that. So I'm going to add a link. And this is why you have to test. Because when I say add the link and I hit save, and if it works, oh my gosh, it worked. What it was doing for me yesterday is every time I hit save, the whole menu system went to that small menu system. So you have to make sure you test everything. So I can't believe it worked on this one. But
of course it works now. That's how it always works. When you want it to work, it's not going to work. When you want it to break, it's going to work perfectly.
Anyway, so testing is very important.
It did it for me too. She's not alone. I tried it as well.
Actually, it may be an IE bug. I'm going to try that in IE, actually. Hold on. Maybe that's a...
Is that what it is? Because I think I did it there too.
Yeah, I think it was IE. Let's try that again.
It would make sense, IE, you know.
But if you think about it, your users, when they're actually going to be editing the site and when they're going to be doing a lot of content, see, that's what it did.
It went to the little condensed menu icon.
So when you think about it, when they're going to actually be editing this page, they're going to be on a desktop. They're not going to be on a mobile device. So
hopefully.
Hopefully. Okay. And again, I just downloaded the Bootstrap, and
So one thing to kind of note, if you're looking to get into this and you want to try it out and say, how do I do this now? There is actually a group of designers. We know most of them, and we've been helping them test a lot of this out on CodePlex, right? CodePlex, we all love it, right? There is a 2013 responsive Twitter Bootstrap solution that you can go out, download, and use. And they've done a really great job with the documentation for how to add it, edit it, whether you have the full-on publishing. And they also show you how you can do it without having publishing enabled. So where you need to go within SharePoint Designer to add the files from their solution to make it work. So while Heather's showing you this one, don't fret. If you want to go home and try it as soon as the conference is over, right? Go out to CodePlex, go look up 2013 responsive SharePoint, and it's the Twitter Bootstrap. And you can download that solution and start to play with responsive design. I will tell you there are still bugs in it that we're still working out. As I've continued to play with it, I send them, hey, this doesn't work quite right. And then they're all doing this on top of their normal jobs, right? It's a community effort. And so they're having to put some of those fixes in place. So there are still bugs in it, but it's pretty good so far.
And it's not opening. Okay, now it is. Let's give it a minute. Okay, so the master page at the top, I started, where is it? And one thing that SharePoint Designer does is it really makes some ugly code in here for you. I mean, that's just nasty.
I really want them to rename the product, by the way. I want them to take Designer out of this. I want them to call it like SharePoint Business Workflow or something, because it's really not a design tool anymore with the removal of design view and the really ugly code they give us.
With the Bootstrap, it gave me a couple of CSS files, and then it gave me a JavaScript file that I wanted to use. So I just referenced those in here. Okay. And again, you can say you're going to call it after a certain file, a certain CSS file.
So a lot of the things that you need to do to make your master page responsive are things that you're adding in to the header tag of your master page, right? So that was the CSS, the JavaScript, all being added into the header tag.
Right. And then I took some of their HTML because I've already done some of the CSS, and I wrapped that around my master page. And the one thing I noticed that when I started working with this, because I used, their A side and then their article, and I used those. When I actually went to the site actions page, you know how you go to different pages and the left nav disappears and things get bigger and things just change automatically? Well, that wasn't happening when I was using the tags that came with Bootstrap. So I had to go back and re-engineer it just a little bit and make sure that those classes were referencing the SharePoint classes. So sometimes you really want to make sure that you're keeping your SharePoint classes in there. Otherwise, certain actions that SharePoint does are not going to take effect, like when your left nav needs to go away for a certain instance.
That's why we say it adds a little bit of time to it. Because I can't just go out and download the Twitter Bootstrap, right? And use all of the same CSS and code from it, because I'm working with SharePoint, right? And things like the modal dialogues and the left navigation and some of those things that appear and disappear and show up and are really key and vital to SharePoint functionality get removed by just straight downloading that, because it's not a SharePoint solution. So that's where having that SharePoint experience, especially if you've worked with master pages in 2010 or 2007, you have a leg up on people coming into 2013 who maybe are just seeing the HTML version of it and not understanding all of this.
Right. So this is, it's a really simple master page. Again, you just got a content box here, go down to the bottom, and you're all done. I've got some plugins in here. And I started, the way that they did it is the CSS, they designed for mobile view first. So what they did is they started off with the simplest view that they wanted, and then they added on from there. Because if you think about it, when you're building your CSS, you've got all the CSS for your whole site.
Can you show some of the CSS with the media queries for them?
Yes. So when you're doing that, then you have to take out so much. So it's easier to actually go up in your browser size and add stuff on. Okay, so again, this is a boilerplate, and it starts out with just some regular what is it, clearing styles? I forget what it's called. So comes down, and we start off with the mobile menu. And again, I Googled this mobile menu. I think I've referenced it in here where I found out how to do it. So I added in my mobile menu, and then it comes back, and we got some IE fixes.
Still a lot of CSS, right?
It does.
It's still, you know, I always tell people, do you love CSS? And people sometimes raise their hands. And I say, great, SharePoint's the product for you because you're never going to get tired of it.
Absolutely.
Because they're going to throw a new one at you every day.
So here's where the first media query comes in. So it says, when you've got a minimum width of 480, you want to do these. So I've made my changes to only a few things here. And then you come down and it asks again. It says, now, when you got a minimum width of 768, and it starts to add a few more things. Because here, now I'm doing a little shadow around my left navigation. So I'm adding in things. I'm adding in more things here.
Has anybody used media queries before? Yeah, a couple of people. They're really powerful.
Yeah, they are. So then I introduce my wide menu at this point. So now it's stretched out, and so I make my menu changes here. So the main thing I had to change when I was doing this responsive design was the menu pieces, because I wanted it to be smaller when it was on mobile, and I wanted it to be larger on different larger devices. And again, I start going up, and then my wrapper gets bigger. Everything starts getting bigger. So that's the whole premise about starting with mobile first. Now, one of the arguments of mobile first is that one guy says you have to design your whole mobile site first and then move up from there. But there's a big difference when you're designing for your mobile device versus just doing some CSS for mobile. There's a huge difference. I've listed a lot of blogs at the end of this that talk about all these different discussions, and I suggest you guys read those. One of the books that we've been reading,
I read it on the plane on the way over.
was Ethan Marquette.
I don't know how you spell his name.
Anyway, Responsive Web Design was a very good book. And then there's Luke, starts with a W, and he's got
Does anybody read the is it a List Apart blog?
Anybody?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Ethan is one of the main contributors there, and
Right.
you can get to the responsive design book. It's really great if anybody has, spare a few hours. It's only a couple hundred pages long.
Yeah, it's not bad. And then the last one
If the blog is a List Apart. If you Google that, it's a great blog for web design. They do all of these. Some of the theories don't apply to SharePoint. I'll be 100% honest with you. They do a lot of JavaScript and some of those that are really fancy targeting and some of that. And I've tried some of it and failed miserably to get it to work. But the responsive design articles in that site are really great and apply a lot to this.
And you'll read about all the different ways of doing things.
I'll also tell you media queries, right? You don't have to limit them just if you're doing responsive design. I actually use them in SharePoint 2010 if I was doing header images, right? So a lot of times I would want to use those image renditions and things like that. So I would target multiple images based off the media query using those sizes for screen, right? So media queries, it's not something that you only can use when you're doing a responsive design site. So that little tidbit of CSS is really great.
Right. One thing I wanted to show you is that when you actually go into a smaller one, you don't have that edit link anymore. So that's gone away. So you're not meant to actually edit this page anymore. And you'd want to, of course, hide your ribbon.
Thought about responsive, the one thing that makes a lot of people excited about responsive is that remember, SharePoint, we love it. We all love it. That's why we're here. Mobile view, right, obviously has always had its issues with SharePoint. And so this is a nice way to get around that out-of-the-box SharePoint mobile view, right? It's kind of what they started doing with device channels, and then designing your site responsive is another way to get around that mobile view.
So again, here's some things you can test with. Again, you've got your Firefox. Chrome has one. So I prefer Firefox over Chrome though. There's more tools for checking. You can go online and use a bunch of other tools. That's gonna, one tool will give you every single view on one screen. And
so I'll tell you, I use some of these other tools for testing mine in IE. Because Firefox gives us that, right? And it looks great, and it may look perfect in Firefox. But then I'm in IE, right? Painful as it is. SharePoint is a Microsoft product, and IE is their browser. And I need to look and see what it looks like in that, too. So I want to, especially with the huge advent of Windows phones and also with the advent of the Surface and being able to see what it's going to look like in IE and multiple versions of IE, right? Remember, we always have to test our browsers multiple versions too. But so being able to use some of those other tools in there to go in and add them in and look at them in different browsers is great.
Right.
We've also got a lot of helpful links here in addition to that CodePlex solution and a list apart.
Yep.
And at the very least, we usually try to wait and let the conference release the session. But what Heather and I will probably do, since we don't want to give you just like, hey, there's all these great links you're going to get in 3 months, right?
Yeah.
So what we'll probably do between the two of us is we'll write a quick blog post with some of these links for you guys and put them out on our blogs so that you can get to some of these links so that you don't have to
Right.
wait 3 months for the DVD to come out to get these links.
Right.
And you don't have to try to read them from your photos that you're trying to snap right now. So we'll get you those links in a blog post between the two of us. We'll probably both write one and put these links in it for you, so you can go to either one. Right. Okay. Anybody have any questions?